Enemy of the state.
An enemy of the state.
Enemy of the state.
Dank Podstash.
You're listening to Enemy of the State's Dank Podstash. The Podstash is available on YouTube, SoundCloud, and everywhere else podcasts are found. Let us know where you want to listen, and we'll release there as well.
If you want to help us improve the podcast, check out our shops at blackmarketmemes.threadless.com and dankpodstash.threadless.com. Links will be provided. Anything you buy helps us make the Podstash better. Business owners and creators, advertise on the Dank Podstash. Reach a larger audience, make more sales. Email us at dankpodstash@gmail.com for details.
Washington State listeners, please check out Washington State Anarchists and Libertarians Facebook group. Help us expand the Agora face to face. Welcome to episode 9 of Enemy of the State's Dank Podstash. My name is Nick, and I'm here as usual with my co-host David. How's it going, man?
It's going all right, man. I'm excited to talk about the drug war. What's up with you?
Oh, just the usual, but we do have a little bit of an exciting announcement here today. Today's episode, we have a sponsor. Our sponsor for this episode is Anarcho Coffee, self-governed caffeine. And Anarcho Coffee is the premier coffee for the anarcho-capitalist, minarchist, libertarian, agorist, and voluntarist. And they also accept cryptocurrency, which is pretty fucking cool. So a huge thank you to the fine people over at Anarcho Coffee for supporting the show. Make sure to check them out on Facebook and other social media and at www.anarchocoffee.com to get your own Anarcho Coffee. Hell yeah, man. This is exciting. New sponsors and ready to move right into an awesome topic. What do we got?
Well, we're talking about the drug war, and I would say drugs win, pack it up and go home government.
I think you're right.
All the evidence shows.
Yeah, it does.
So, getting into just diving headfirst in some information here. What is the drug war? Well, the drug war is a campaign led by the United States government of drug prohibition, military aid, and military intervention. Its stated aim is to reduce the illegal drug trade. The term drug war was popularized by the media after Nixon's press conference on June 18th, 1971. So, I don't think that they're going to reach their stated aim ever, because so far they've done nothing.
No, of course not. In fact, they've added to the illegal, quote-unquote, drug trade through the CIA and whatnot.
Most definitely. But before getting into all that, let's take it all the way back. There's always been, since I think 1904, maybe, that could be wrong, but I think since like 1904 there's been taxes and such on various drugs and what have you. And, things similar to the Drug Enforcement Agency that we have now. But back on December 17th in 1914, the Harrison Tax Act was approved. It was a federal law that regulated and taxed the production, importation, and distribution of opiates and coca products. And the Harrison Tax Act consisted of 3 U.S. House bills that put restrictions on the availability and consumption of opium. Though technically illegal, the sale, distribution, the sale and distribution and use was still legal for companies and individuals who registered. So basically, if you gave the government their cut and you did what the government wanted, you were allowed to be their drug dealer.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, that's just, it's pretty much like legalization now, right?
Yeah, it's very similar. And it's a common thread throughout, history of all their attempts to, deal with the quote-unquote drug problem.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. It's just pretty crazy that this stuff was available. And even though it was readily available back then, it wasn't really used recreationally as much as it was for medicine, right?
Yeah, definitely not. It wasn't. Most drugs weren't recreationally used back then. They were, not necessarily prescribed, but given to patients by doctors, usually wrongly. You got ghosts in your blood, go smoke meth about it. Even though meth didn't exist. Even though meth didn't exist then,
Sure.
But yeah, well, when was it that it was? I guess that's further on in the information that it started being more recreationally used.
Right.
But,
yeah, and that kind of throws into the kind of racist origins of some of the laws and terms, right?
Oh yeah, that goes to a point coming up here. But after that, one of the main things that happened after that was in 1936, the propaganda film Reefer Madness was released in the U.S. It was originally financed by a church group to warn parents about the dangers of cannabis use, which is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And it was later purchased by Dwayne Esper, who recut the film for distribution on the exploitation film circuit, which an exploitation film is a film that attempts to succeed financially by exploiting current trends and niche genres, lurid content. It was directed by Louise Gasney, or I don't know. I slaughtered that. But,
who cares? He directed it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, with it, he attempted to create a link between violence and cannabis use. And the film featured a group of high schoolers who were lured into cannabis use, which led them down a path to hit-and-run accident, manslaughter, suicide, attempted rape, hallucinations, and descent into madness due to cannabis addiction.
Yeah.
Which is that's laughable.
It is, absolutely.
I'm sure people, and sadly, people still cling on to those beliefs, and especially some of the racist beliefs that were that came out not but a year later, because on August 2nd, 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was enacted, and it was drafted by Harry Anslinger. I know you got some stuff to say about Harry Anslinger.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, he's the racist origin, right? Of pretty much the word marijuana. I think he used that for the first time in legal proceedings.
Yeah, the Marijuana Tax Act was originally spelled with an H.
Right.
And was definitely an attack on the influx of Mexican immigrants, be them legally or illegally. My borders.
Mm-hmm. Although it is important to make the distinction that most of them came in legally at that point. I don't know. It's just a point in history.
Yeah, Yeah, you're absolutely right. I just don't give any fucks about legality.
Sure. One thing that I found, I'm from Arizona originally, and I learned that Sheriff Joe Arpaio, that piece of shit from Arizona, was a disciple and worked directly under Harry Anslinger and learned a lot of his racist and ridiculous prohibition tactics from Harry Anslinger. They called him Dimebag Joe, I believe, when he was working in Chicago, because he didn't give a shit about busting higher up dealers or anything like that. He loved busting people with small amounts and throwing the book at them. Just because he's a piece of shit, from everything I can gather. Maybe it made more money for the state, but he continued with his bullshit in Arizona, just continuing on that path, and also founding Tent City, I think it's prison. It would be technically a prison in Arizona, a bunch of tents in the desert where the inmates wear the striped suits with pink underwear and get rotten bologna sandwiches to eat, things like that. He's a real piece of shit.
Sounds like a piece of shit.
Mm-hmm. Well, he comes from a line of pieces of shit, apparently.
Oh yeah. So being a piece of shit is genetic, more genetic than than his claims that people of color, etc., are more prone to be violent because of these drugs.
Right. Yeah. It's just such ridiculous. It's just so ridiculous. I don't know. Let's continue on with the facts, because I could rant about how ridiculous that is.
Well, back to the Marijuana Tax Act. It was a tax that was placed on the sale of cannabis, and definitely, in my opinion, as well as people that are far more intelligent than me. It was an effort to protect wealthy businessmen who had a lot to lose by the cheap production of hemp. Marijuana and cannabis plays a big part in the drug war, and at that time they had invented a new technology that made it a lot cheaper to strip the bark and stalk and stuff from any product, which made hemp much much cheaper to produce. So it was Randolph Hearst. He had an extensive timber holding, and that was in direct competition with the production of hemp because of wood pulp and such.
Right. He was a newspaper tycoon, right?
Something like that. I'm not exactly sure. I just know that in my research, I found a lot about his timber holdings, and that plays big into it in my mind.
Yeah, he had Hearst Communications, built the nation's largest newspaper chain and media company, and I think that's why he was so opposed to it, because the hemp pulp would just completely replace wood pulp in the market as far as making paper and whatnot. And that it's a weird thing. Sorry, kind of derailed because I know there's more people to talk about.
No.
Hearst has always fascinated me, and anybody who's for prohibition of especially hemp, who has timber holdings, oil reserves, investments, whatever, companies, anything that hemp can replace more efficiently. It's always just baffled me why, with the insane amounts of money that they made on the older technologies, they didn't just invest into hemp, because they'd make more money off of that, right? If it's cheaper to produce, to grow the hemp and then produce your products out of it, why wouldn't you make the switch? You're continuing, obviously making money with, let's say, paper pulp, wood pulp for paper and whatnot. But I don't know. It just seems like you can make a whole lot more, a whole lot faster for a whole lot cheaper switching over to hemp. So,
well, maybe there was some cost to switching out, having it, all of the equipment that they already had set for, timber and stuff, and switching it to hemp. That's probably a lot of money to make that switch.
Oh, absolutely. I just figured it would be kind of a gradual thing. Like you see a lot of the big car companies now switching to electric or anything like that. So I don't know. The tinfoil side of me thinks there's something more to that. And I'm sure looking hard enough into it, there is. But
yeah, I mean, what I've gathered, it's just bare bones research just to get some information. So I'm sure that there's plenty of things that nobody really knows about that went into these kind of decisions back then.
Right.
I mean, if you had some media empire with newspapers and such, and you had all these timber holdings and all of your money was tied up in it, you'd probably be like, nah, I don't want to switch. This is how I want to do it. So I'm going to do everything I can to keep the switch from having to happen.
Yeah, that could be. I don't know. I really don't know, because it depends on, I guess, how visionary you'd be if you owned all that technology that could be, if it could be even converted over to work with hemp, And I guess if they were afraid that someone else would get up and running before them and dethrone them as far as their, empires, their wood pulp, oil, media empires, whatever, then yeah, I guess trying to strike it down as quickly as possible would be the route to go. And listening to some information on this specifically, the Marijuana Tax Act, it sounded like it was just a clear lining of pockets with money to get this thing through, because there's no scientific or moral basis or anything like that. So it could absolutely just be complete and total greed from these guys.
Well, another one of these guys is Andrew Mellon. Probably slaughtered that last name. It's probably not how it's pronounced. But he was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time and the wealthiest man in the United States. And Andrew had heavily invested in the DuPont family's new synthetic fiber, nylon, which was a competitor of hemp. So
Well,
that's
there it is.
clearly, yeah, exactly. Clearly, there could be a conspiracy behind all of that, which I definitely believe there was.
Interesting. Yeah, I can't remember. It was on, obviously, the Tom Wood Show, because I love listening to the Tom Wood Show. That I was listening to a really interesting guest talk about all this stuff. So more information can be found there. But it just is mind-blowing to me, the money that could have been made, the advancements that could have been made if it weren't for greed, from then to now. It's just so short-sighted.
I mean, that's one of my biggest problems with government and the state, is that they stifle innovation.
Yeah, it's not
People
the
are able
free
to-
market.
Yeah, exactly. And if you can use this monstrous apparatus that is the state to consolidate your power and wealth, that's like, why would anybody think that's a good idea?
Well, I guess
I've heard arguments that
at that point it's like, you have it all, you might as well just hold it.
yeah, for that individual, I mean, sure,
Yeah.
it makes sense for that person, that power-hungry person, but I mean, in the grand sense of things, people like the regular Joe person who could think of starting their own business, with an entrepreneurial mindset, it's extremely bad for that kind of mindset.
Absolutely.
But luckily, the Marijuana Tax Act was overturned in 1969 by Leary versus the United States.
Well, so now it was overturned, and so cannabis was just kind of in limbo then, as far as tax sales and whatnot.
During that time, there was other, like, a common thread throughout all of this is that they're always trying to find a way to tax and control, drugs, especially, the production of hemp and, cannabis.
Yeah.
But, other drugs as well, not just these things, fall into a lot of these categories. And I can't think of what it was, but there was another one in there. There was another laws had been passed. So it's almost like layers of tax laws on top of tax laws, just like we have now.
Sure.
So one gets overturned, yet there's still this one underneath it.
Right.
So it's still taxed.
So that was kind of the beginning of the end then. Once they got these first Tax Act laws going, it just got buried in so many layers of, bureaucracy and taxes that it was going to be pretty hard to extricate it.
Definitely. When you look at the timeline, I mean, you can see a regular push gradually towards taxing and controlling these things and making the state in charge, basically making, the state be the only one that is allowed to decide if you can sell these drugs or not, or if these drugs can be sold or not.
Sure. Interesting.
And it was in, let's see. Yeah, the next big thing in my mind would be the Boggs Act in 1952. And on November 2nd, 1951, President Harry Truman signed the Boggs Act into law, and it set mandatory sentences for drug convictions. So a first-time offense conviction of marijuana possession carried a sentence of 2 to 10 years and up to $20,000 as a fine.
Jeez. It's a little harsh.
Yeah, and on January 4th, 1952, under the provisions of the act, over 500 people were arrested.
Well, that number has grown exponentially for sure.
Oh yeah, definitely. I believe something in the upcoming laws from the Nixon administration did away with the Boggs Act. I'm not exactly sure. I was trying to figure out what happened with all that, but it's really convoluted and hard to figure out.
Well, it's weird hearing the 2 to 10 year sentence and $20,000 fine, because I was thinking, like, well, how much different is that from, fines and sentences now revolving around cannabis and other drugs and whatnot? And it's so strange because it just fluctuates, I guess, depending upon the judge, right? Because there's people in jail for life for completely nonviolent and medicinal use or attempt to use cannabis medicinally to heal themselves or family or whatnot. I hate bringing up Kim Kardashian, but didn't she go to the White House and convince Trump to let a lady out who was serving life for some sort of medical cannabis charge?
I have no idea.
That's something I was listening to the other day, and it was interesting the point the person who was talking about it brought up. I cannot for the life of me remember who was talking about it or where I was listening to it, but they were saying Kim Kardashian's done more for people's freedom through doing that, through going and talking to Trump and convincing him to release this woman who had done nothing wrong other than break a completely illogical, irrelevant law, who was serving life. She's done more for freedom by getting that done than like voting or anything like that has.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say she's done more for freedom than even voting. I don't know.
If she did it, I'm going to give her credit.
It hurts me. It hurts me on the inside to say that. How about that?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I mean, if it's a life saved and it was actually her doing it, I'm going to give credit where credit's due, and then ignore her.
Well, I mean, if she went to Trump and got him to do this one thing with this one person, yeah, she did more for that one person's freedom.
Sure.
But he only did it because he was like, hey, this famous person who is attractive wants me to do this thing. So I'm going to do this thing because I can't think for myself.
Yep. Well, it's at least good use of a platform, which is surprising from her.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll give her that then. How about that?
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm going to vomit because of that.
Oh, whatever, man. Even shitty people have their good points sometimes.
Was it a broken clock is still right?
Yeah, a broken clock is right twice a day.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
We need some terrible mismatched euphemisms on this show.
I love
more
those.
Of that.
I love when people mismatch them. It's so great. Like some of my favorites, like from Boondock Saints. Why don't you make like a tree and get the fuck out of here?
Yes.
Good stuff.
I watched that the other day. I haven't seen that for a while.
Well, that's a bit of a derailing, but I can't wait for the third one to come out if it ever does. But anyways.
Oh well. I'll derail it about Boondock Saints. I don't care.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah. But moving on.
Yeah.
Since you're right, the next thing was all the way in 1970, and it was the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. And it is a federal law that requires the pharmaceutical industry to maintain physical security as well as record keeping for certain types of drugs. The drugs or controlled substances are divided into 5 schedules. You know, these are the controlled substances that everybody talks about, the schedule whatever drugs.
Yep.
So Schedule 1 drugs have a high potential for abuse and no medicinal value. And cannabis is still a Schedule 1 drug, despite the overwhelming evidence that it does have medicinal value and has a low potential for abuse.
Right. Isn't that crazy? That's clearly just a money grab.
Yeah, and supposedly through this Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention Act, the longest title ever, there's ways to get these things off of them because of evidence against it, yet it has still never gotten, cannabis has still never gotten taken off of it as a Schedule 1.
That would happen, obviously, if they made it federally legal in the U.S., right? Because all the states are doing it.
They would have to, I believe they would have to do that first before they would have to take it off of that Schedule 1 list for it to be legally allowed to be legal, which is a weird thing to think.
Sure. Yeah. We'll get into the weirdness of legalization later, I'm sure, but...
Yes.
Interesting.
So continuing on, I guess.
Yeah.
For the Schedules 2 through 5 on that list, the substances, they decrease in abuse potential. And the schedule a drug is placed into determines how it will be controlled. Prescriptions for drugs in all schedules must bear the physician's Federal Drug Enforcement Agency license number, though some substances in Control 5 don't require a prescription. So again, it's the state only allowing drug dealers to exist when they make money for their people or the state.
Right. Well, they're all under the umbrella with their different bureaus and industries and whatnot. They're all under the state umbrella, so it all ultimately goes back to them, whether it's monetarily or just permission, power granted.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so many agencies, so much money. I guess it is jobs created through this and money made, but not good jobs, not jobs that need to be here or money that needs to be made or stolen.
It's like the least jobs that could be made from that.
Mm-hmm.
There could be more. Like if you went from this, from like a minarchist perspective, like I'm sure you will kind of throw in ideas from that perspective later on about legalization,
mm-hmm.
but it makes more sense to have it be legal because there would be more jobs, there would be more tax money, there would be more of all of these things that I don't necessarily like, but are more positive than what is the actual outcome of these agencies and the drug war itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Much more money in the market for these things than in the prohibition for them. And I think at that point it just kind of comes back to control, wanting to have control. And then I know that police unions, and I'm sure not just police, but other law enforcement and agencies, unions lobby against legalization because they know they'd be losing their honeypot, getting all their sweet military gear and whatnot to fight the drug war and all that, and then all the money that they get to seize, all that stuff, that all goes straight to their budget, the stuff that they seize and then auction off. And I'm sure all the drugs in the evidence locker get sold back to the CIA for them to sell back onto the streets to get confiscated and so on and so forth.
And we'll definitely get into that in just a second. Let's finish up this part where, which is the actual Controlled Substances Act, which is Title II of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. It's basically the legal basis for the war on drugs. It consolidates numerous laws pertaining to the regulation of the manufacture and distribution, oh my God, of narcotics, depressants, steroids, hallucinogens, and stimulants, as well as chemicals used in production of controlled substances. So,
yeah, that's the
one everybody brings up. Yeah, exactly. It's them wanting control of that market. They want complete and utter control of the drug market. So that, instead of somebody going and getting, this or that for their depression or their, what have you, and not to bash legit medications that do help people for these instances, because I'm not one of those people that's like, hey, fuck vaccines, fuck meds. Like, they do help some people. Mm-hmm. It's not a lie. You look at the data and it's the truth. But if somebody has the option to go to their local buddy who, grows some weed or something random, and they get that and it helps them more than, the prescription drugs, then that's the state losing, out on money.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this kind of thing also definitely ramps up, creates a lot of the opioid addictions, because through all the state control, the price is so expensive, going through prescriptions, through your doctor's insurance and whatnot. And that's why people, they get hooked on those opiates that way. They can't afford it and they seek out heroin.
Yeah. And people want to say that, we have to have the drug war because of that problem. Yet the drug war created that problem.
Exactly.
And the pharmaceutical industry, helped that too. So it's the drug war and the pharmaceutical industry, which they're tied together because, the laws say, and they pushed, OxyContin, and as soon as they were able to get shipments and things illegally into, let me put on my tinfoil hat, even though it's pretty well known.
Yeah.
Afghanistan is how, people like the CIA and stuff are in control of the heroin market.
Oh, absolutely.
So they prescribe people, Oxycontin and stuff like that, opiates. And then suddenly they were like, oh, all of this, we can't do it anymore. It's not going to be the same. We're going to change meds and basically make these things illegal or heavily regulated. So they pushed all of those people that wanted those things and that were addicted to those pharmaceutical drugs towards heroin, which they are also making money off of. This is why they want control of that market.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes me think of a couple things that I've seen before. One of which was a really interesting article I read about, like, pretty much, I don't know, it's like technically legal drug dealer doctors in Florida, because, you know, obviously there's a lot of old people down there, so there's a lot of prescriptions being written. And there was a thing where they wouldn't check if you had a prescription from one doctor to another. So you could go to these, like, almost drive-through, like quick in and out thing, like, I don't know, a little doctor visit kind of deals, and get a prescription. So people had like tons of prescriptions from different doctors in their name, and were getting a ton of pills, Oxycontin, opiate, any kind of opiates, you know, and they were able to get so many that they were just selling them. They weren't necessarily using them and making money off of them. And the state was still getting their cut, but then they discovered what people were doing and that they could get a bigger cut by cracking down on it harder, and decided to do that. And really, I guess it hurt people who were using it legitimately, of course, but it definitely stopped people from getting these large amounts that way in order to sell it. And then I also saw an interesting article the other day concerning Afghanistan and the Middle East in general, with the army and whatever over there, with the military over there. There was something saying that the U.S. military is going to start setting up ways to extract resources from those areas in order to pay all the costs of the quote-unquote war that we've been at over there, including mining and oil, and I would imagine opiates, but of course they didn't mention that in the actual article. So once again, follow the money and you figure out exactly what the fuck is going on.
Everybody knows why they went over there.
Oh, yeah.
And so they're slowly coming out and admitting it, being like, oh, so now we're going to, like, use this to offset the cost, blah, blah, blah. No, that was the whole reason in the first place.
Yeah. Well, it's the slow power grab that they leak bit by bit to the public so that people don't get up in arms about it.
Oh, yeah. It's always been like that. I mean, the drug war is a good example of that you can watch the slow implementation of them doing things and then slowly, you know, admitting to it.
Yeah. Drug war, gun laws, taxation, all that stuff. It's all the same slow creep.
There's a quote from John Ehrlichman from Harper's Magazine in 1994 that I found that I don't hear mentioned very much when I talk about this. Like, I've talked about the drug war a lot with random people, and nobody ever mentions this, and I found it. And it's this is the quote right here.
Okay.
The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Like, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Yeah.
Yeah, they know.
And yeah, they will admit it, many of them. And John Ehrlichman was, you know, very close to the president, involved. He was a counsel and assistant to President President Nixon for domestic affairs, and like, so he was involved in all of this.
Sure.
And knows.
Absolutely.
And that makes complete sense to me. It's just a continuation of Anslinger's bullshit from, you know, back in the late 30s.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually have a little bit more about Anslinger that I wanted to get to, just because people really need to see what a terrible person he was. If I could go into that real quick.
Go ahead, please.
So I guess prior to 1910, marijuana didn't even exist as a word in American culture, and it was cannabis was used instead, and they were used obviously or cannabis was used for extracts and medicines, just medicine in general. There was a big hashish trend going on with wealthy Americans at that time, and so it was kind of like we were saying before, it was more medicinal, but then also somewhat recreational for, like celebrities and what they would call elite Americans and whatnot. And so that's what was going on before the word marijuana was used in the U.S. And then between 1910 and 20, it says 890,000 Mexicans legally immigrated to the U.S. seeking refuge from the wreckage of a civil war in, the Mexican Revolution there. And that's the word came across. And I'm not sure of the exact etymology of the word, why it was spelled with an H, or why it's even a word that, how they put it together to make it racist. But they did, because it was considered racist. And they called it loco weed as well. Things like that. And then it led on into reefer madness and whatnot. And it was in the 1930s, after the Great Depression had hit and people were searching for someone to blame, they decided to start blaming the influx of immigrants, mostly in the South. And with that, the rise of jazz music, because they considered it suggestive. And they, a lot of white Americans began to treat it as a foreign substance used to corrupt minds and bodies of low-class individuals, because blacks and Mexicans were associated with the jazz scene and whatnot. And it's just another part of the racist roots in the States at the time. And Harry Anslinger, he was one of the primary individuals, as you mentioned before, for creating that stigma around cannabis, and was the first director of Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930 and launched his campaign against it. He testified before Congress explaining that marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. This is his quote, by the way. Most marijuana smokers are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana usage. So it's just bullshit. They just completely made up. And people bought it because who fucking knows? But it's just completely ridiculous. And it's blatant racism. Another quote from him. He says, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races." And there's just no scientific anything whatsoever behind that. It's just straight prejudice. One of the things that he jumped all over was, I believe it was a young Mexican boy, probably teens, I think, like 14, that was supposedly high on cannabis and chopped up his whole family with an axe. And that's something I wanted to talk about as we were talking about how they used violence surrounding cannabis or the culture or whatever to demonize it, is that it can emphasize mental problems that people have. Absolutely. Just like any drug can. That doesn't put the onus on the drug as far as being the bad thing happening, right? It's just an amplification of a disorder already. So people have to be careful in their use of it, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, take anything in moderation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's just crazy. It's crazy that it was started with the roots of racism and then, of course, greed.
How many things like that are there in this country, though? I mean, that's not very surprising to me. The majority of things that we deal with now and are still arguments have roots that tie back to racism.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like police.
I'm sorry if anybody listening is one of those people that's like, what? Everybody's racist against white people now. Like, no.
Everybody's shitty to everybody. Like, Jesus.
Exactly.
It's just identity politics and bullshit.
It's not making it a race issue when it's not a race issue. It is a race issue.
Right.
When you look at the history of all of this information it ties back in strongly with racist rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just ignore those facts and make it about something else.
Yeah. Yep. It's a part of the conversation that needs to be recognized.
Most assuredly.
Well, it's just a fallacy. Any other time someone gets pissed off when legitimate racism is brought up and they, oh, you're just going to play the race card. It's just like they have nothing more to say.
Yeah, it's stupid. Like, I'm not one to, I'll say that the majority of people in the country aren't racist.
Mm-hmm.
But institutionalized racism is a thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can clearly tell that it is.
Yep.
Like,
well,
the data shows.
Yeah.
The information shows that it's legitimate. Well, what did if you hate the state, like, why do you care?
Yeah. What was that there in one of the quotes you had here, I think it was that last one you read from Ehrlichman. That's what it is. He said we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. So that's systemic racism right there. The system wants to make it illegal to be black one way or another. And then we talked about this in our law enforcement episode too, in Baltimore, and I'm sure other places as well. There was systemic, things put into place, specifically on deeds to property, deeds to houses in certain sections of the city, that on the deed it said it couldn't be owned by African American people. Like, you could only pass that deed on through legal sale even to other white people to keep the community separate.
Jeez. I think there's, I've read some other things similar to that. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but it's absolutely not surprising.
Yeah, it's there. And anyone who says it's not are full of shit, because you can look this stuff up and see it for yourself. It's really not hard.
Yeah, I mean, most of the BS coming from that comes from the dreaded alt-right that doesn't exist, yet I fucking argue with them consistently, and they claim that they exist. So
sure. Well, yeah, they admit they exist. But now the problem is anyone, just people who throw that out there as soon as you disagree with them or one of your stances is slightly further right than theirs. Well, you're all right. And it's just like, shut up.
Yeah. Of course, that's how it goes.
Yeah.
Well, let's move to let's talk about some solutions here, some problems with the drug war and some solutions.
Yeah.
You want to go with problems first or solutions first? I know you're itching to talk about legalization. I don't know how much time do we have left there, sir?
We got like 15 minutes or so. We're still doing good. So yeah. If you had specific problems or solutions that are separate, you should go ahead with those, because I guess legalization I would consider kind of a mix of a problem and a solution.
I mean, I only really have one solution, but I'll go into some problems.
Okay.
That's for sure. The example of prohibition is a huge thing. When the 18th Amendment passed in 1919, homicides rose steadily from 1920 to 1933. And then when the 21st Amendment passed, which ended prohibition in 1933, homicides diminished for straight 11 years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's drastic evidence that shows that prohibition incentivizes violence.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Alternative markets.
People will say, it's the black market, but those of us who read up on various markets and agorism and stuff like that, we understand the red market versus the black market.
Absolutely. So, well, even like defense of, say, your product when you're in a black market that wouldn't be red market. If someone's trying to take your shit and you're defending it, that's self-defense. And that's part of the violence around it. Or if the cops are coming after you to take your product, whatever, it's legitimate, from a moral standpoint, but it's all, of course, chalked up as violence. What's
The
that?
red market incentives, I would say would be to, silence leaks leading to your arrest. So somebody's going to rat on you, you deal with that.
Sure.
And dealing with debtors, and both of these things are involved in the Ross Ulbricht case.
Yes.
Where he's locked up for this, and these are things that the dude didn't want to do, but he was like coerced into it by the state to start thinking about these actions, and then they capitalized on that and went after him, and he's locked up.
Yep.
Which is terrible.
Definitely, everybody should look up Free Ross or hashtag Free Ross.
Yes.
And
Yes.
show some support for him in any way that you can.
I mean, we can't talk about the drug war without bringing up him.
Yeah, Ross Ulbricht.
Let's see. Think about the another negative, the incarceration rate in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The whole corrections thing, prisons, jail, probation, parole, not necessarily having to do with drugs and things like that, but it roughly costs $74 billion, and it was $74 billion in 2007.
Right.
And that's from the Bureau of Justice Statistics.
That's what it costs taxpayers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
I mean,
one more problem with policing and for-profit prisons.
how about that? We got $74 billion for the prison system. And then $30 billion for the Drug Enforcement Agency,
Yep.
which has an efficiency rate less than 1% on stopping drugs going in and out of the United States.
Yeah, they're making money hand over fist with the for-profit prisons and civil asset forfeiture and all that stuff. Taxpayers are paying this to the people who run these private prison and policing. Well, not private policing, but privatized prisons, and then to the police forces that, go hand in hand with them.
And then back to the drug war's stated goal, of reducing the illegal drug trade. 1 in 5 people incarcerated is locked up for drug offenses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's 1 million drug possession arrests each year, just possessing drugs. 1 million every year.
That's crazy.
More than 6 times as many arrests are for possession as for sales or manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
So is it really about dealing with the illegal drug trade, or is it revenue generation for the state?
I think we know the answer to that.
I think everybody knows the answer to that for sure. Well, I'll let you go on about. I could continue on, but let's hear some more from you.
Well, my beef is with legalization, specifically the Libertarian Party pushing so hard for legalization and their constant shaming that they do for anyone who doesn't follow along with them, whether it's on voting, legalization, whatever. So let's jump into legalization a bit, because there's people call for legalization, people call for decriminalization, and they're different, and I don't want either of them. I don't want anything on the books at all for drugs. Just let people do their thing, keep the state completely out of it. So let's see here. Well, legalization is obviously on the books that people are allowed to use whatever drug, let's say cannabis in this scenario, legally under U.S. law, right? And there's still regulations that go along with that. How much you're allowed to possess, travel with, if you're allowed to sell it, how much you're allowed to sell, how you're allowed to grow it, cultivate it, all that stuff. You have to register plants here in Washington if you want to grow them. So it's not like a huge victory as far as freedom. It makes it so that you aren't necessarily going to go to jail as long as you stay in the lines under the rules of the government, And as far as I know, and certainly not in every case, once it's made legal, not all records, criminal records for drugs are expunged. It has happened sometimes in some cases. And it doesn't just automatically let everyone out of prison who's there for nonviolent drug offenses. I mean, where's the victory in that? I'm sure more people aren't going to go to jail, but all the victims are still victims, and you still are living under the government's thumb in major ways. There's just tons of other regulations, and then the taxation, you're making the government stronger with the billions of dollars that the government pulls in from legalization and how they tax it. It's just ridiculous. I just cannot for the life of me figure out how that is something that libertarians think is a victory. It's strengthening the state and switching one set of victims for another. So that's legalization in a nutshell. Let's see here. Decriminalization, it's not the same, obviously, as legalization. It means the state repealed or amended its laws to make a certain act criminal, and you're no longer subject to prosecution, though. So in the context of cannabis, this means that individuals caught with small amounts for personal consumption won't be prosecuted and won't receive a criminal record or jail sentence. But in many states, possession of small amounts it's treated like a traffic violation, so fines. You may have to go to court to pay the fine, whatever, things like that. So I don't really see that much of a difference, but I guess technically there is a difference. So, and even where it's been decriminalized, possessing larger quantities or selling it have significant penalties. So with decriminalization, that doesn't bring along with it a legal industry. You're still getting your whatever you're getting from gray or black markets. You won't be arrested, but you can be penalized for having it. And the makers, growers, sellers are all facing harsh penalties as well. Now, I think everybody knows the massive success story as far as less deaths, less violent crime, less overdoses, and less addiction with all drugs being decriminalized in Portugal. So that's good for those people, but it's not good for the people who are still trying to push those products out onto the market, which is not a bad thing in any way. It should be up to every individual what they choose to put into their bodies, what they choose to use. So I just think it's ridiculous that anyone who, yells the slogan taxation is theft, like a lot of people in the LP do, think that the taxation of marijuana is okay. It's just a huge victory whenever it's legalized in any state. And I'm starting to see that in pretty much everything that the Libertarian Party is pushing. I really think that there are a bunch of snake oil salesmen who are there to make money through the party and get power, through a political channel. And the slogan, all of your freedoms all of the time, is dishonest and should be changed to, if they were going to be honest about it, it should be changed to all of your freedoms all of the time as long as you follow the rules.
Exactly. I love that saying.
Yeah.
I can't, the thing is that most libertarians are minarchist.
Right.
They believe in small government. So they're fine with a lot of these things because they're fine with their small government controlling these things. Yet I can't understand and get my mind around the fact that there's so many things that they are accepting of that just those things that they're accepting of do not equate to small government.
Right. Or even to any sort of actual freedom. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just, if they were to come out and say, I'm a minarchist and I don't believe that all taxation is theft or extortion, and, actually stand behind the stuff that they're pushing instead of pretending like they're on the same page as anarchists, voluntarists, agorists, whatever. Just being deceptive in that way and trying to recruit more people to their scheme, I wouldn't have a problem. I don't mind talking with big L libertarians, minarchists and whatnot, and finding ways that, common ground to work together to end the state in one way or another. But it's when people are lying about it that they're just not being completely honest, and they have a separate agenda.
That's very true.
Yeah. I don't know, gets me a little fired up. But I was flipping through all of the tax rates for cannabis, the cannabis industry, medical and whatnot. And state I used to live in, Arizona, medical has a 6.6% state tax they can add 2 to 3% optionally. And I was looking on here, and something about a federal tax on. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I could have sworn I'd seen federal tax on state legal marijuana, which is hilarious because federally it's illegal, and yet up there, still give me some of that money, but I might raid you. Look out.
Yeah, they don't have to abide by their rules. What are you talking about?
No, of course not.
they don't care.
And yeah, Washington has a crazy tax rate for this. The medical, which the medical industry got screwed over when they legalized recreationally here in many different ways. That's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down. But the medical industry, they have a 30% excise tax on that. And then retail or recreational is 8% state tax on top of that 37% tax. And you can see in like Washington and Colorado how many billions of dollars the states have made off of, extorting the legal cannabis industry. And it's just adding more power to the enforcement and everything that they want to do. So legalization is not the answer. The black market and the gray market are the answer. It keeps the money completely out of the hands of the state. And you're never going to convince me or reason that giving the state more money and letting them enforce their rules on how people use a plant is a good thing.
Something that the whole drug war thing and everybody just completely ignores is, one of the basic principles of economics, and that's supply versus demand.
Mm-hmm.
All these states that have legalized marijuana recently all used to fight against it and call it a problem. And they realized that if you remove the supply without removing the demand, the price goes up.
Right.
It causes more of these problems. After legalization here in Washington, the prices dropped exponentially. Even in black and gray markets, it's dropped substantially.
Right.
And it's more readily available. So, it
sounds like the place to get it then.
Yeah, I guess.
I guess that brings up another thing that I've been seeing a lot, because people are always asking for answers, especially when you say that voting is useless. Well, what's your solution? What's your plan? And whenever you bring up, disobedience, civil disobedience, whatever, doing illegal things that aren't morally wrong and doing anything you can to not support the state, they said, well, if you do that, you're going to get arrested or you're going to face the consequences of the state and whatnot. It's like, no shit. Do you think you can just not risk anything for freedom, for a stateless society? Right. Like, do you think they're just going to roll over and be like, all right, if you guys ask us enough, I guess we'll go away? Fuck no. That's not what's going to happen. That's never fucking happened. And it won't happen. It requires sacrifice. Everything requires sacrifice. Taking time to study something is sacrificing your time in that moment to be good at it later. It comes down to anything as simple as that. Sacrificing your safety from the state in any way you can. You don't have to go out there and make yourself a target, obviously. It hasn't necessarily come to that yet, but it might soon with the red flag laws and killing over gun confiscations and whatnot. We'll see when people get the fire lit under their ass, but there's going to be risk of life, limb, and the little freedom that people have now to gain more. That's how it's always been. And I don't see a way without taking risks that we'll be able to move forward.
Exactly. I don't I don't get how people think that. I mean, throughout history, civil disobedience was used as a way to move things forward, and I don't understand how people get that, you know, or how they think that they're just going to be able to sit back, actually do nothing, and then have freedom happen.
Yeah.
I don't understand that.
Well, a lot of people are confusing freedom as long as you follow the rules with actual freedom. And that's that slow creep that we were talking about earlier. It's just like, well, if we let you do this little bit, see, that's nice. Doesn't that seem like some good freedom? Just don't step out of line. They're like, yeah, oh, less risk, and I get to do this thing as long as I stay in line. I don't know. I know a lot, if not most, of the founding fathers of the U.S. were definitely statist, and some very much worse than others. But there were some who held anarchist or at least voluntarist ideals, even though they weren't necessarily labeled as such. And I think it would benefit a lot of people not to just disregard the writings and acts of them in their time and apply some of that to now, because they weren't idiots. They were very smart people. And there's a lot to be learned there, especially when it comes to sacrifice for freedom.
Definitely. A lot of people, yeah, to the people listening that may have argued with me about how people like Martin Luther King and such, they used the state to get what they wanted through voting, etc., and getting things done, blah, blah, blah. What did they really do? They used civil disobedience.
Yeah, it's a culture change first, and then it doesn't matter what the vote is.
Exactly. Yeah, and they completely ignore that. And I'm like, hey, but civil disobedience, that's what's going to be the change. That's what's going to happen. We all stop listening. They can't do anything. We all just do what we were going to do regardless. They can't do anything.
Right. And if they try to do something...
Are they going to lock you up for a little while? Yeah, exactly.
If they try to do something, back it up.
Yeah. I mean... Martin Luther King sat in jail constantly for breaking the law.
Mm-hmm.
For breaking the law. Let me repeat. Breaking the law. Civil disobedience.
Exactly.
They went against the state. They didn't sit around and wait thinking, well, if I vote, maybe they'll give me my freedom. No, they went and they took their freedom.
Yep. And
they snatched it back. And
sometimes it has to be done in a public manner that might get you tossed in jail, and other times it doesn't.
Yeah.
It's death of 1,000 cuts. That's a good way to bleed out the state. But sometimes things come to a head.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was definitely an enlightening episode, man. Lots of, like the actual facts around the drug war that I didn't know, that I think a lot of people don't really care about, but should, because it just gives you another leg to stand on when you're talking about it with people who support it.
Yeah, I mean, all that information, everybody should take the time to, study the drug war. It's a good example of how the state incrementally, raises the heat on everybody in that the frog in the boiling pot scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So resist consciously, directly, any way you can. Resist. Don't get complacent and fall for the lies of legalization and freedom under the rules, because freedom doesn't exist under the rules. But that was a good one. And I just want to remind everybody again that we're very thankful to Anarcho Coffee for sponsoring today's episode. Just remember, Anarcho Coffee, self-governed caffeine. I really like that slogan. You can buy it with cryptocurrency, fiat. I'm pretty sure they accept whatever. And you can get that at www.anarchocoffee.com, and check them out on Facebook and their other social media. That's ANARCHO Coffee, one word. All right, man. Good job, and we'll catch you next time.
Hell yeah. Later, everybody.